December 1972. A jagged limestone karst splitting the border between South Vietnam and the Kingdom of Laos. The sky is the color of a fresh bruise, heavy with the weight of the winter monsoon. The wind whipping past the fuselage is sharp and bitter, a freezing contrast to the humid furnace of the valleys below. Inside the cramped, vibrating cockpit of an O-2 Skymaster forward air control plane. Flying low at 3,000 feet, the only sound is the low rhythmic drone of the twin engines and the erratic hiss of the radio receiver. Suddenly, a blinding flash of orange light erupts from the green canopy below. A Soviet-made 37mm anti-aircraft shell tears through the starboard wing, shearing the aluminum skin like tissue paper. Within 3 seconds, the aircraft is locked in a terminal, burning spiral, screaming toward the jagged teeth of the jungle. The pilot, his face sprayed with hydraulic fluid and shattered plexiglass, wrestles with the dead controls as smoke chokes the tiny cabin. He punches the canopy release, the freezing wind ripping the helmet from his head, and throws himself into the empty gray sky. His parachute opens with a violent, spine-cracking snap just 300 feet above the trees, dropping him through the triple canopy branches like a stone through a glass window. This is happening every week. Every single week, somewhere along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the North Vietnamese army has hidden a massive supply artery under a roof of living green, American pilots are vanishing into the mist. Their survival beacons are silent, swallowed by the mountain valleys, leaving behind nothing but the distant, mocking distortion of an empty frequency. The wreckage is already burning in the ravine, a funeral pyre of jet fuel and magnesium, while NVA search patrols fan out into the brush, their tracking dogs catching the scent of fresh blood and burnt nylon. Outside his tiny hiding spot, an elite enemy infantry unit is tightening the noose, waiting for the dawn to reveal his tracks. To understand what happened to that pilot on the limestone karst, you first need to understand that this was never a story of Hollywood rescues or daring fighter jets streaking across the clouds. It was a single microscopic slice of a secret war that took place in a country where the United States military was legally never supposed to be. A war of black ops, denied missions, and forgotten men. It is a story about the precision instrument on Warren's wrist, and the unspoken rules of a wilderness where survival was measured not in miles, but in seconds. And that story begins not in the Laotian jungle in December, but 2 years earlier in the polished glass showrooms of San Francisco, and later on the sun-baked, oil-stained tarmac of Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base. The pilot wasn't an aggressive, hot-blooded academy graduate looking for a combat decoration to kickstart a political career. He was a 25-year-old captain from the coastal valleys of Oregon, a young man who had spent his youth studying mechanical engineering and drafting blueprints in his father's clock repair shop. A boy who had been told by his flight instructors that his meticulous mathematical mind made him perfect for the cold precision of instrument flight. His name was Thomas Tom Vance, and before this night is over, he will not save the world, nor will he receive a Medal of Honor to be hung in a Pentagon hallway. He will simply make one quiet, terrifying decision in the dark, and the family who waited for him back home would spend the next 50 years looking at a stopped watch, trying to decode the final minutes of his life. Before the Air Force handed him a pair of silver wings, Tom Vance's world was defined by the clean, predictable laws of physics and the steady, reassuring tick of grandfather clocks in his father's workshop. He was a boy from a rain-slicked town outside Eugene, Oregon, where the timber trucks roared through the mist, and the nonning louder than the animal mills was the sound of the Pacific crashing against the rocks, miles away. Before the military machine pulled him into the gears of the air war, Tom's world was regulated by the cyclical rhythms of pendulum swings and the quiet geometry of watch escapements. His father, Arthur Vance, was a veteran of the Second World War who had returned from Europe with a trembling right hand and a deep, unshakable distrust of human words. He had locked himself away in his workshop, finding solace in the absolute predictability of gears. Arthur had taught his son how to repair delicate timepieces when Tom was barely 10 years old. It wasn't a commercial trade for them. It was a deep, almost spiritual devotion to order in a world that was often chaotic and unforgiving. His father used to tell him, standing under the yellow glow of a jeweler's loupe while the winter rain beat against the cedar shingles, "Tom, a cheap watch tells you the time, but a masterpiece tells you your place in the universe. A gear doesn't lie. A spring doesn't panic under pressure. If you respect the mechanism, it will keep you anchored when everything else around you falls apart." Tom learned the heavy discipline of stillness and extreme focus. He could sit at a workbench for 8 hours without moving a muscle or lifting his head. His tweezers holding a balance wheel finer than a human hair, letting the world outside dissolve until there was nothing left but the perfect microscopic harmony of brass wheels and ruby jewels. When Tom graduated from his advanced flight training in the spring of 1970, his father had looked at his new silk captain's bars, his calloused hands rough against the polished metal, and said nothing. The old man knew what lay ahead. He recognized the look in his son's eyes. The naive belief that the military was just another large, well-oiled machine that functioned according to logical rules. Arthur simply reached into his coat pocket and laid a small, heavy box wrapped in green leather onto the oilcloth kitchen table. Inside sat a Rolex GMT-Master, reference 1675, its iconic red and blue Pepsi bezel gleaming under the low-wattage living room lights. It was a watch designed for international aviators, built of brushed surgical steel, capable of tracking 2 separate time zones simultaneously via a dedicated fourth hand. His father had spent 3 months' savings on it, purchasing it from an authorized dealer in San Francisco who catered to Pan Am captains. With the steady hand of a master maths craftsman, Arthur had spent an entire night engraving a short sentence onto the stainless steel caseback. To Tom, "Keep your true north." On his left wrist, that watch became more than an instrument. It was a physical extension of his sanity. Months later, Tom was stripped of his civilian identity and dropped onto the screaming, chaotic airfield of Udorn, Thailand, where the air smelled of vaporized JP-4 jet fuel, melted asphalt, and industrial corrosion inhibitors. The base was a massive hive of technological violence, operating 24 hours a day to sustain the secret bombing campaigns over Laos, while other young pilots decorated their flight suits with colorful, profane squadron patches, grew reckless mustaches, or spent their monthly hazard pay drinking cheap gin and chasing girls in the neon-lit bars outside the base gates. Tom kept his Rolex immaculate clean. He synchronized it every morning at precisely 0500 hours with the base atomic clock, setting the primary hand to local Southeast Asia time and the triangular GMT hand to the morning hour back in Oregon, where his father was just unlocking the door to the workshop. It was his anchor against the madness. When the vibrations of the cockpit made his hands shake, he would press his thumb against the smooth steel casing of the watch, feeling the rhythmic, tiny heartbeat of the movement inside, reminding himself that an orderly, peaceful world still existed across the ocean. By July 1972, the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron was grinding through a relentless air interdiction campaign known as Operation Steel Tiger. The progress of the war was measured not in territory captured, but in numbers of supply trucks destroyed, secondary explosions recorded, and miles of trail cratered. The environment of Southeast Asia consumed airplanes faster than the logistics units could ship replacement parts from the United States. Every functional airframe was pushed to its absolute structural limit by crews who worked in 12-hour shifts under the blinding sun, and Tom Vance, along with his fellow forward air controllers, familiarly known as the Ravens or Nail pilots, had been humping a slow, unarmored Cessna light twin through the flak-filled valleys for 8 consecutive months. The tropical heat on the Thai flight line was an active, malicious enemy. It rose off the concrete in shimmering, gas-grawed waves that distorted the horizon, turning the unconditioned cockpits into aluminum greenhouses, where temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It rotted the leather sweatbands of their flight helmets and turned their survival vests into heavy, salt-encrusted weights that chafed their skin raw until they bled. During the afternoon monsoons, the sky would dissolve into a gray wall of water, forcing them to fly beneath the clouds' ceilings, sometimes just 50 feet above the jungle canopy, where the muzzle flashes of enemy anti-aircraft guns looked like angry red eyes winking in the deep green foliage. They were exhausted, their faces hollowed out by sleep deprivation, their minds permanently warped by the constant, agonizing anticipation of a shoulder-fired Strela missile locking on to their engine exhaust, or a sudden, deafening burst of 23mm cannon fire that would tear their small plane to pieces before they could even broadcast a mayday call. The squadron was a collection of fractured men pulled from every corner of America, their nerves frayed to thin wires. There was Major Granger, the operations officer, whose face had hardened to stone after his wingman was blown out of the sky by a radar-guided battery. There was Miller, a young lieutenant from Ohio, who spent his nights staring blankly at the ceiling fan while drinking lukewarm beer, and Doc Holliday, a veteran pilot who carried a pocketful of Lucky Charms instead of survival gear and refused to speak to anyone who had been in country for less than 6 months. They had no common ground except for the collective terror that bonded them together during the pre-dawn intelligence briefings. The United States military operated on a doctrine of total technological supremacy. The high command in Saigon believed that laser-guided munitions, computerized B-52 strikes, and millions of gallons of defoliants could choke the North Vietnamese logistics machine through sheer material attrition. They called it systems analysis warfare, managed by computers at Task Force Alpha in Nakhon Phanom, which tracked the enemy using acoustic and seismic sensors dropped into the jungle. But on the ground, beneath the triple canna jungle of Laos, the 19-year-old grunts and the FAC pilots learned a completely different lesson. The enemy operated on absolute, terrifying patience. They didn't build massive concrete supply bases or move in convoy lines during the day. They waited in deep limestone caves for days, weeks, breathing through bamboo tubes, moving their cargo only when the mountain mist rolled in so thick that no American radar could penetrate the valleys. They would wait for the perfect moment when a low-flying O-2 Skymaster entered a narrow ravine, opened fire with 5 hidden machine guns simultaneously, and vanished back into the green abyss before the fighter bombers could even clear their ordnance racks. But it was what happened during a routine post-flight inspection in August that changed Tom Vance forever. A damaged F-4 Phantom had made an emergency landing at Udorn. its fuselage shredded by anti-aircraft fire over the plain of jars. The backseater, a young radar intercept officer from Texas named Billy Jenkins, had been killed in his seat by a piece of shrapnel that had penetrated the cockpit floor. When the maintenance crew dragged the body from the cockpit, Tom happened to be standing on the flight line waiting for his intelligence debrief. The young Spong officer's flight suit was soaked in dark, drying blood, but his left hand was hanging loosely over the edge of the canvas gurney. On his wrist was a cheap, government-issued plastic watch. The plastic face was smashed, the hands frozen at exactly 1432 hours. The precise second the missile had detonated beneath his seat. Tom looked from the frozen plastic watch to his own Rolex, the red and blue bezel shining brightly in the harsh Thai sun, the sweep-second hand moving with absolute, indifferent fluidity around the black dial. The watch didn't care about the dead boy from Texas. It didn't care about the smoke rising from the runway or the tears of the crew chief. It just kept counting, a cold, mechanical record of time passing without mercy. That night, sitting in his quarters by the light of a single candle while the rain poured outside, Tom looked at the engraving on the caseback. His hand shook as he rubbed his thumb over his boss's words. He realized that out here, time wasn't a measurement of life. It was a countdown toward an exit, a cold ledger that recorded how many seconds you had left before the jungle claimed your name. But it was what happened during a mission over a hidden valley near Mujia Pass that broke Tom's belief in the precision of the war. His aircraft had spotted a small convoy of bicycle porters moving through a clearing. The protocol from the Airborne Command Center was absolute. Mark the target. Tom rolled his aircraft into a steep dive, his heart hammering against his ribs, and fired a white phosphorus rocket into the center of the clearing to leave a plume of white smoke. Within minutes, 2 F-105 Thunder Chiefs streaked over the ridge, dropping canisters of napalm that turned the clearing into a roaring sea of orange fire. When the smoke cleared, Tom flew low to assess the damage for his post-mission report. Through his canopy, he didn't see military trucks or weapon crates. He saw a collection of straw huts and farmland that had been completely incinerated, the bodies of local villagers. Women and children who had been forced to move supplies, reduced to charcoal in less than 3 minutes. The intense heat pushed his light aircraft upward, the smell of burning vegetation and scorched flesh rising through the air vents, filling his lungs. In that single, suffocating moment, the grand architecture of Tom's purpose crumbled into dust. The patriotic speeches about defending freedom, the flag-waving parades in Eugene, they felt like a sick, cruel joke played on young boys. He wasn't a precision instrument of justice. He was a spotter for a machine of pure destruction. That evening, he didn't clean his watch. He wanted the black carbon residue of the flight to stay on the steel links. He wanted to feel the heavy weight of his own guilt every time he checked the hour. By December, when he was assigned to the night reconnaissance mission over the Laotian border, Tom Vance was no longer the mathematical boy from Oregon. He was a ghost flying on borrowed time. The ambush on the limestone karst in December had ground down to a primal struggle for survival. The O-2 Skymaster had broken in two upon impact with the trees, and the rear engine was burning violently in the ravine below, lighting up the thick mountain mist with a sickly orange glow. Tom Vance lay in the mud at the base of the karst, his left ankle shattered into fragments, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that tasted of blood, zinc, and aviation fuel. The survival radio in his vest was dead, its housing cracked open by the force of the fall, emitting nothing but a low, rhythmic hum of broken transistors. He was completely alone, in the dark, the stars blotted out by the dense canopy above. He could hear the distant, coordinated shouts of the NVA search party, moving up the steep limestone trail, their flashlights cutting through the fog like long, pale fingers. He pulled his sleeve back. The Rolex was still ticking, its tritium markers glowing with a faint, ghostly green light in the shadows. The hands pointed to 0412. In less than 2 hours, the sun would rise, the mist would burn away, and the search party would find his parachute silk hanging from the branches. Tom didn't panic. His mind reverted to the cold, analytical math of his father's workshop. He couldn't walk on his shattered leg. He couldn't call for the rescue helicopters because his frequency was dead. He had a standard issue, .38 revolver with 6 rounds of ammunition. A weapon that was entirely useless against an infantry platoon armed with automatic rifles. He looked at the Rolex again, the triangular GMT hand pointing to the quiet afternoon hour back in Oregon, where his father was likely sweeping the sawdust off the floor. He realized with absolute clarity that the watch was no longer a symbol of home. It was a death sentence. The highly polished stainless steel casing and the bright red and blue bezel could catch the first rays of the morning sun through the leaves, acting as a mirror that would give away his position to any scout looking down from the upper ridge. Without saying a word to the empty dark, Tom reached into his survival vest and pulled out his heavy knife. He didn't use it to cut away his harness. He forced the tip of the steel blade beneath the edge of the rotating bezel, prying with all his remaining strength until the iconic red and blue ring popped off and fell into the mud. Then, using the flat of the heavy blade, he systematically smashed the plexiglass crystal face, crushing the thick plastic down into a web of deep silver fractures until the face was warped. And the sweep-second hand caught hard against the collapsed material, shuddering to a permanent stop. At exactly 0412, Tom Vance voluntarily took himself out of the mechanism of the world. He crawled through the rotting vegetation on his belly, leaving his flight helmet and his torn parachute behind. He moved like a timber rattlesnake, using his elbows and the toe of his good boot to slide through the wet leaves, leaving no broken twigs or deep tracks in his wake. He pressed his face into the wet earth, inhaling the smell of decay and old moss, a smell that was exactly the same as the swamp bottoms where he used to fish as a boy. The jungle was trying to reject him, but he refused to be found. He found a narrow crevice beneath a massive limestone boulder, a space barely large enough for a man, and dragged his body inside. He covered his legs with handfuls of wet mud and ferns, locking his muscles into absolute, agonizing stillness. The minutes stretched into an eternity that no watch could measure. A large black centipede crawled across Tom's bare wrist, its sharp legs scratching the skin right where the Rolex had sat. But he didn't flinch. A cloud of mosquitoes swarmed around his eyes, drawing blood, but his face remained as frozen as the stone above him. He was waiting for the forest to forget he was there. He could hear the search party pass within 10 feet of his boulder, the sound of their canvas boots squelching in the mud, the low murmur of their voices as they inspected the burning wing section down the slope. He could hear his own heartbeat rushing through his ears. A heavy, metallic thumping that sounded exactly like the rhythmic trip hammers of the Oregon lumber mills. He measured his survival not in hours, but in breaths. He would inhale, count to 10, exhale, and wait. For 3 days and 3 nights, Tom Vance remained inside that stone sarcophagus. He had no water, and by the second day, the fever from his shattered ankle began to play tricks on his mind. He began to hear the grandfather clocks from his father's shop ticking inside, the stone walls of the cave. He hallucinated that the limestone boulder was a giant clock case, and he was just a small, broken cog that had fallen out of the gear train. He looked at his wrist in his delirium, forgetting that the watch was broken, seeing only the ghostly green glow of the tritium paint. He found himself Tog's father in his mind, apologizing for letting the mechanism break, apologizing for becoming part of a machine that burned children in clearing zones. The boundary between the Oregon woods and the Laotian jungle dissolved entirely. He was a boy again, lost in the timber, waiting for his father to find him with a lantern. When a rescue helicopter finally spotted his tiny pencil flare on the 4th morning during a brief break in the monsoon clouds, the extraction team didn't find a heroic Air Force officer. They found a creature that had ceased to look human. His flight suit was torn to ribbons, his skin gray from infection and covered in hundreds of bloated black leeches, his fingers tightly clenched around a broken, bezel-less piece of steel. He didn't speak to the pararescue medics who pulled him into the vibrating bay of the HH-53 helicopter, nor did he look out the door as the green mountains of Laos receded into the distance. He simply lay on the aluminum floor, his thumb running over the jagged, smashed plexiglass of his watch face, his eyes fixed on the empty ceiling while the rotor blades roared above him like a broken mainspring. Tom Vance returned to Oregon in the spring of 1973, but the boy who had loved the clean harmony of watch gears never truly came back. His physical wounds healed. He walked with a heavy limp for the rest of his days. But his mind remained locked in that limestone crevice at 04:12 in the morning. He took over his father's workshop after the old man passed away in 1976, but the grandfather clocks remained silent. He stripped the shop of its delicate brass gears, its small lathes, and its velvet liners, replacing them with heavy saws, adzes, and planes. He took a job rough-cutting cedar beams for barns and fences. Heavy, mindless labor that required brute physical force rather than intellectual precision. He wanted work that made his muscles scream, so his mind wouldn't have the energy to remember the smell of burning fuel. He moved his bed to a dark corner of the basement, away from the windows, because the sound of the wind through the fir trees at night made his chest tighten with a frantic, unblinking terror that no medicine could soothe. He never wore a watch again for the rest of his life. If a neighbor or a customer asked him the time, he would simply look at the length of the shadows on the grass or the color of the sky, refusing to acknowledge the mechanical hands that governed the modern world. He became a ghost in his own town, a man who spoke only when spoken to, who lived on the extreme margins of a community that was too eager to forget the war they had seen on their television screens. He never joined the local VFW post. He never hung his flight jacket in the hallway. He simply let the town believe he was just another eccentric timber worker who had lost his mind in the service. The presidential unit citations and the official military histories would eventually publish grand, multi-volume books about the air campaign over Laos, detailing bomb tonnage, flight hours, and target coordinates down to the last digit. The generals would receive their commendations, and the politicians would write their lucrative memoirs about strategy, geopolitical containment, and peace with honor. The veterans knew the system would simply wait for them to die of their wounds, their cancers from defoliants, and their memories before acknowledging the raw truth of what happened in those forbidden valleys. But the truth didn't require a medal or a marble monument in Washington, D.C. to exist. It didn't care about the grand narrative of the Cold War. It existed in the permanent pocket-sized ledger of a captain's survival. It existed in the frozen gears of a smashed watch face, a silent piece of steel that had stopped counting the hours, because its owner had discovered that some moments are too heavy to be measured by time. In the summer of 2018, when Tom passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 71, his nephew found an old green leather box hidden in the back of a cedar chest, beneath a stack of faded flight logs and old letters. Inside lay the remains of the Rolex GMT-Master. The red and blue bezel was gone, its face cracked and clouded by the moisture of a jungle that had never truly let him go, the steel hands permanently locked at 04-12. The engraving on the stainless steel back was nearly worn smooth by 45 years of friction against the velvet lining of the box, but the words were still legible in the light. To Tom, keep your true north. The nephew tried to turn the crown to wind the watch, but the internal mechanism was fused, frozen by the salt of an old sweat and the rust of a secret war. It was a monument of a single, terrifying choice made in the dark. A record of the moment a man decided that to survive, he had to let the world leave him behind. If you had been in Tom's position under that limestone karst, would you have smashed the watch that connected you to your father? Or would you have kept it ticking as a final link to the world you left behind? Does a precision instrument lose its value when it stops telling the truth, or does it become something more? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more raw stories that peel back the myths of military glory to find the human heart, underneath make sure to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and let's discover history together.